We are live. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Woo Woo. My friends, have I got some woo woo for you? Today on Woo Woo, we shall be discussing whether or not Jeffrey Epstein was a CIA asset. Luckily for us, we have an expert interview with a guy who just happens to know the truth on all that. Then we talk angels and demons and who we really are. My friends, you who watch my show, you're about to see the Bitcoin brand go crazy. Going up in a few weeks, up to Boston. I'm going to Boston. We're opening a club outside of Boston. Met with some great guys today at the club. There are a couple of venture capitalist guys. They happen to manage just a little bit of money. I think right now under management, they got about $8 billion under management. They were very impressed with the club. They want to help any way they can with the clubs. Good for them. Good for the billionaires. But guess who doesn't need their money? Me. I don't need their money. And that annoys them. Oh, well. What's the use of having fuck you money if you never say fuck you? Yes, I did it. Actually, did you tell them they could each buy 4 Founders Group Worldwide shares? I actually did, and they want to. Oh my God. Here's a question. Hey Ben, do you think the ETFs will try a pump and dump? Whether they're not worried about that bullshit. They're not worried about pump and dumps. They're worried about getting as much fucking Bitcoin as they can get before this shit kicks off. Don't look at the price, folks. If you're looking at the price, you're doing it wrong. I promise you're in a year, 2 years, it's not going to matter if you bought it 50,000 or 38,000. You're not going to care. All you're going to care about is that you bought it. All right. Here we go, folks. Here we go. Question number 1 on Woo Woo. Was Jeffrey Epstein an asset of the CIA? My answer is yes, because they told us he was. That's why they gave him the charges they gave him here in Florida, because the federal, the FBI, and the CIA told the prosecutor, you're going to have to make this go away because he's one of our assets. Really? Here we go.
When I was researching the Franklin scandal, and I can prove that he was a blackmail photographer. I have police reports on him. I said, how does this work? Because I was still investigating, and I was still trying to get my mind around it. And he said, it's like you're on a yacht, and it's a beautiful yacht, and it's a beautiful day. And you can have anything on this yacht that you want. But if you decide to get off the yacht, the people on the yacht are going to make sure that you drown. And our politicians are on the yacht. And there's zero incentive for them to come out and say that they're being blackmailed.
How can I help? How can I be useful in ending needless suffering? Do not be afraid of work that has no end.
We have to organize a social movement.
We have an opportunity to lead by example versus just talking, hot air. I think the more people in this fight, the more we grow. Eventually it could change. The people are the ones that can make the change.
Welcome to Change Agents, an Ironclad original presented by Montana Knife Company. Andy's unavailable to record the intros this week for the show, but I'm a producer on the show and wanted to tell you about an incredible conversation Andy recently had with best-selling author and investigative journalist Nick Bryant. Nick is the author of books including The Franklin Scandal and the upcoming book, The Truth About Watergate. He's also the director of the organization Epstein Justice, which seeks justice for the victims of Jeffrey Epstein. Now, you may have read his work in outlets including Vanity Fair, New York Magazine, Gawker, and heard interviews with Nick before. But in this conversation, he goes in areas you probably haven't heard him talk about, particularly on the topic of COINTELPRO and intelligence agencies' ties to Jeffrey Epstein and potentially covering up widespread abuse among politicians and powerful people. This week, as courts are releasing new information about individuals connected to Jeffrey Epstein, we wanted to bring you this timely conversation between investigative journalist Nick Bryant and Andy Stumpf.
I'm just curious, how you kind of found your way to this particular topic, because you were early on in the discovery or revelation of what was going on with him.
I'm a freelance writer. I live in New York City. And I was talking to a Rolling Stone editor. And he said, pitch me some stories. And I said, well, what kind of stories do you want? And I'd written about some very dark subjects in the past. And he said, pitch me dark stories. The darkest stories you can think of. And, I kind of threw my hands up in the air and I said, Nazis, Satanists. I mean,
and two good candidates.
And then there was that little glint in his eye when I said Satanists. And he goes, Satanists. So I had a simple plan. I was going to meet some Satanists and I was going to go to a black mass and write an article and get a paycheck. It was going to be, as I said, it was a simple plan. But when you're writing, most writers that I know are like this. You're always trolling for subject matter that's tangential to what you're writing about. or possibly related to what you're writing about. And I came across a U.S. Customs report about a cult called the Finders. And they were headquartered in Washington, D.C. And I wrote a book called The Franklin Scandal. And I took the entire U.S. Customs report on the Finders and put it in the book because it's almost incomprehensible. But anyway, what happened was the Finders were headquartered in Washington, D.C., but they were all over. They were a cult. And there were two Finders that were busted in a park in Tallahassee, Florida, with 6 children, ages 2 to 5 or 2 to 6, I believe. And some concerned citizens called the police. The police showed up. They took one look at these kids who were ragamuffins, and they arrested the 2 Finders and put the kids in protective custody. And I do have the Tallahassee police report, and a physician examining the kids said that 2 of the kids had been sexually abused or showed signs of sexual abuse. And these 2 Finders were arraigned on a number of child abuse charges. And there was child pornography in the van. So U.S. Customs was called in. U.S. Customs generally handles child pornography investigations. And the Washington, D.C. police contacted the Tallahassee police and said that they'd been looking into the Finders for quite some time about an unsolved homicide and also abuse of children. So the D.C. police and the U.S. Customs got a search warrant on the Finders warehouse in Washington, D.C. And what they came across was some very shocking stuff, including child pornography. And there was also instructions for how the Finders would infiltrate families as babysitters and get intelligence on families. So at the end of the report, the U.S. Customs agent that wrote the report was Ramon Martinez. And at the end of the report, he goes to the DC Police Department. And he's told that the DC police have disengaged, and because the Finders have become a CIA internal matter, and the U.S. Customs would ultimately be disengaged, and so would the FBI. And I looked at that document and I thought, there is something I'm missing in life. This document does not make any sense to me whatsoever. Why would the CIA come to the rescue of some very strange people in a cult that were doing allegedly extremely negative things to children? And I started digging into it, and I found another case that was somewhat like it in Omaha, Nebraska. And I ultimately spent 7 years on that, investigating that case. And I wrote The Franklin Scandal, a story of power brokers, child abuse, and betrayal. And it was connected to the 2 pimps in that network. And it's almost like a carbon copy of the Epstein network. The 2 pimps in that network were Lawrence C. King and Craig Spence. King was out of Omaha. Spence was in Washington, D.C. And King would get kids from all over, including Boys Town, the esteemed orphanage on the outskirts of Omaha. He plundered Boys Town quite heavily, but he would get lots of kids, and they would fly them to Washington, D.C., and there would be pedophilic orgies in Craig Spence's home, and both King and Spence were pedophiles. And Epstein, that we know of, had hidden cameras in 3 of his homes, and probably in New Mexico too. I can get into that a little bit later. So Spence's house was wired for audiovisual blackmail, and Spence was a CIA asset. And they ran this network Spence and King ran this network for about 10 to 12 years. It was much bigger than Epstein's network. It produced a lot of child pornography, but it was ultimately covered up by state and federal authorities. And I don't know if your viewers are familiar with how grand juries work, but a special prosecutor is chosen to present evidence and call witnesses for grand jurors. And grand jurors are just citizens that have shown up for jury duty and they've been funneled into a grand jury. Grand jury elicits, like the gods of jurisprudence have spoken, but basically it's just citizens that have shown up for jury duty that have been funneled to a grand jury, and then a special prosecutor presents them with evidence. It's not prosecutorial. It's whatever the special prosecutor shows the grand jurors is what they're ultimately going to make their decisions on and indict, which is formally criminally accuse someone. So in Nebraska, there were 2 grand juries that said that this network did not entail any child abuse whatsoever. And I managed to acquire the sealed grand jury documentation, exhibits, and testimony. And I really, in my book, The Franklin Scandal, I bring the reader into a grand jury, which is illegal. I was not supposed to be able to, I was not supposed to have that material, and I certainly wasn't supposed to publish it. But I felt like what was covered up was just so evil that I was willing to take my chances with it. So I really demonstrated that that network had been covered up by law enforcement. In Nebraska, it was primarily the FBI, but also state law enforcement participated. And that grand jury actually indicted 2 kids that would not recant their accounts of abuse. And one of the kids was Alicia Owen, and she wouldn't recant her abuse. She was 21 years old, and she'd been trafficked as an adolescent. And she wouldn't recant her abuse in front of a federal grand jury. So she was ultimately looking at 200 years in prison because she wouldn't recant her abuse, and she still refused to recant her abuse. And then one of the boys who wouldn't recant his abuse, accounts of his abuse, was looking at 60 years in prison. And to sanctify that grand jury, they had to put Alicia Owen away. And the majority of the book is her trial. And I really show just how perfidious her trial was. And she was a 21-year-old girl from a working class family that had been trafficked as an adolescent. And it was a real kangaroo court that convicted her. And that trial was unbelievably corrupt. But anyway, she was sentenced, she was a kid. She was sentenced between 9 and 15 years in prison for perjury. And she had to do 2 years in solitary confinement. And I found that the injustices were just so seismic in that case that I found that I had to write about it. So that book was published in 2009. And I started digging into this world in 2002. And Epstein came across my radar in about 2011. And I ultimately went down to Florida in 2012 and started digging into Epstein. And that's when I acquired his Black Book. And I brought the Black Book back to New York City, and I tried to get publishers to publish it and let me write an article about it. And it took me 3 years before I could get someone to publish it and let me write articles about it. It was, and that was Gawker, which has unfortunately been sued into oblivion at this point. But it's interesting, there was a grand jury in Florida that found that Epstein hadn't molested a single child. And the Palm Beach Police Department, which initiated the investigation into Jeffrey Epstein, had 5 victims, underage victims, that they had statements from. And then they had people that corroborated the victims, but they knew of 17 more victims. So the Florida law enforcement and the judiciary knew of 23 Epstein victims at that point. But that grand jury only called 1 Epstein victim. And that special prosecutor, Barry Kirshner, skewered her. So that grand jury didn't find Epstein guilty of a single count of child abuse. And the corruption has just cascaded since then.
What you're describing, I would consider myself to be a sane person is absolutely mind-bending.
It's mind-bending, and but what's truly unfortunate is that you've got the federal government covering up child trafficking, both in the Franklin scandal and also in the Epstein scandal. The U.S. attorney for the Southern District of Florida was Alexander Acosta, and that's who was ostensibly supposed to prosecute Epstein. He had a list of 32 Epstein victims. I have that list. And he did not charge Jeffrey Epstein with one count of child abuse. And after he had been U.S. attorney, he was nominated to be Trump's labor secretary. And he was being vetted by the Trump administration. And they asked him, why didn't you go after Epstein? And he said, I was told that Epstein was intelligence and that it was above my pay grade and to leave it alone. So you have in the Epstein case, you have a U.S. attorney standing down from prosecuting child abuse when he has a list of 32 victims. Now, here's where it gets really mind-boggling. Constitutionally, there's only two people in the government that can tell a U.S. attorney to stand down. One is the president and one is the attorney general. That message can be delivered by a minion of the president or the attorney general, but only one of two people can tell a U.S. attorney to stand down. So that's the kind of power that was deployed to make sure that Jeffrey Epstein wasn't indicted by the feds. And Alexander Acosta has been questioned about what he had said to the Trump administration, vetting him about that Epstein was, that he'd been told that Epstein was intelligence, and he's never denied that at all.
Do you remember the first time you came across Epstein's name in your research when you were looking into these type of behaviors?
It was about 2011, I believe. And I'd spent 7 years investigating and writing the Franklin scandal, and I went as deep into a child trafficking network as someone can go. I mean, I got to one of the blackmail photographers, and I got to other people that were definitely privy to the intelligence connection and the hidden cameras. And then I found a number of victims. I had that grand jury that covered up the abuse in Omaha, Nebraska, that indicted those two kids. They had a list of 60 victims, and I got all the grand jury documentation. So I had a list of those 60 victims. And there were a lot more victims, but there was a state investigator that had found 60 victims. And my job was to find those victims. And unfortunately, and we see this with the Epstein case too, unfortunately, a lot of those kids came from very dysfunctional backgrounds.
Yeah.
And then they were repeatedly molested, and the carrot was drugs. And if they performed, they were given drugs. And then at a certain point, they would be expunged. And we saw this with the Epstein network too. At a certain point, they would be expunged because they would lose their youthful marketability. And then what you have is a severely dysfunctional young adult that oftentimes goes on to commit crimes so they can feed their addiction and thereby end up in prison or end up as felons or in some way compromise their own credibility. So it's almost a perfect system that you take these kids and really damage them, and then they will eventually go on to compromise their own credibility.
Well, I would imagine in your research that you came across a variety of names. What was it about Epstein that drew your attention and more scrutiny?
The cover-up with the grand jury. That was a telltale sign. I've written a lot about children's issues. I started writing about children's issues in 1990. I mean, I've written about a lot of different things. I've had a freelance writing career that spanned like 30 years. But but I've written a lot about children's issues. And actually, I wrote a book about I co-authored a book about lower socioeconomic children that was published in 1995. So I'm sensitive to children's issues. And then once I saw what was happening in the Franklin scandal, where these kids were getting trafficked, and then I came across other people that came to me. When you write a book like that, you become kind of like a lightning rod. And a number of people had come to me and talked about being trafficked and could I investigate. And I'm just one guy. I really, felt bad that I couldn't investigate all the allegations that came to me. But the thing that stuck out about Epstein was I felt that there were major legal aberrations that occurred in Florida. And I can remember going down there, and I'd spent 7 years on the Franklin scandal, and I didn't really want to investigate another network. I really didn't. But at that point, the media was just depicting Epstein as a lone pedophile. But then when I managed to acquire his black book, there's scores of victims in the black book, as well as power brokers. And I started calling victims. And they were telling me about being flown around and also about the island. And I realized he was running a network, a very big network. And as disheartening as it was, and I knew that this was going to be very difficult for me, because the Franklin scandal had been very difficult for me, and people didn't want to listen to me. And I knew that Epstein was going to be difficult. But on my first trip to Florida, I acquired the black book, and I thought, well, here is the black book. Publishers are going to take note of this. I'm not just pitching them conjecture. I've got Epstein's black book that has scores of victims, as well as a lot of power brokers. And people, I live in the mecca of publishing, New York City, and no one in New York City wanted to touch it until Gawker. And it took me 3 years to get it published. But when I started to call those victims, I knew that I was dealing with another large network. And actually, the network in the Franklin scandal, I think it was a larger network than Epstein's, but it had been around for, as I said, 10 to 12 years. Whereas I think Epstein had trafficked children for about 25 years. It wasn't as big. It was big, but it wasn't as big as the Franklin network, but it was around at least twice as long as the Franklin network.
Ladies and gentlemen, I could not be more fired up to introduce the presenting sponsor for season 2 of Change Agents, Montana Knife Company, founded by somebody that I feel very fortunate to call a personal friend, Master Bladesmith Josh Smith. Not only a master bladesmith, but the youngest master bladesmith and one of the most experienced in the world. Montana Knife Company blades are some of the finest that I've ever been able to get my hands on. They are the sharpest knife out of the box, and they're some of the easiest to resharpen when you dull the blade. I take them everywhere that I go. I have them in every vehicle that I own and every backpack that I ever take into the backcountry. Specifically, my favorite blade of theirs is the Speedgoat. It's lightweight, but so incredibly capable. I never leave home without it. If you're familiar with Montana Knife Company, you know it is often very difficult to get one of their blades because they sell out within minutes of being released. What you should be able to find in stock are the Blackfoot 2.0, Speedgoat, or a Stonewall Skinner. And if you use the code CHANGEAGENTS10, that's going to net you 10% off of your first order. Again, my personal favorite blade is the Speedgoat. If they have them in stock right now, don't mess around. Put it in your cart and complete the checkout. Montana Knife Company, they build working knives for working people. And like I said at the beginning, I could not be more proud to collaborate with them on Change Agents Season 2. There's a lot of things I like about the Mountain Tough program, but I think primarily what I enjoy is they focus on mental toughness in addition to just the physical toughness. Everything they do is grounded in one purpose: life transformations and being strong between the ears in the mind. And there's also a community of 15,000 plus Mountain Tough athletes. So the community is strong, they're supportive, and they're going to help keep you accountable. So you can train anywhere, you can stream anywhere, you can access guided training and on-demand workouts right from your phone, your tablet, or your TV or computer, whatever you're into. And everything you need is in one spot. The Mountain Tough subscription gets you access to all the Mountain Tough programs, new programs, and bonus content. And they have programs for everyone. Those who hit the gym and heavy weights, those who like to work out at home with no gear or minimal gear, and everything in between. Mountain Tough has been the trusted training by the dedicated for years now, including U.S. military special forces and dedicated backcountry hunters. There is no excuse for you to not start today. With Mountain Tough, you can conquer your goals with the ideal program for your lifestyle and schedule. Train with equipment or just your body weight on your phone, tablet, TV, or web browser. Most importantly, they will help you train your mindset so you are always ready for anything that life throws your way. Mountain Tough subscribers get full access to world-class home and gym programs, groundbreaking mental toughness training, self-improvement, prehab and rehab, biomechanical form coaching, stretching and mobility flows, nutrition guidance, challenge workouts, and the global Mountain Tough community. Mountain Tough is offering Change Agents listeners an incredible offer. You're going to get 40% off on the all-new Mountain Tough Plus annual subscription with the code CHANGEAGENTS. Go to mtntough.com and enter the code CHANGEAGENTS to receive 40% off, a savings of about $100 on your Mountain Tough Plus annual subscription. That is MTN, Mike Tango November, tough.com, and enter the code CHANGEAGENTS to save 40%. That is less than 50 cents per day for the best in-class physical and mental training. Where did he come from, and how was he able to achieve this position? I don't want to use the term power broker, but this person who was so interconnected with people at the highest level of politics in this country.
That's difficult. Epstein was a college dropout from a blue-collar family in Coney Island, New York. And what we see in the Franklin scandal, I was talking about those two pimps, Lawrence E. King and Craig Spence, they both came from blue-collar families. And both of them were in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. And King was in Thailand, and he was given a top security clearance, and Spence was an ABC reporter. And I'm extrapolating this, but I believe that both of them got busted molesting boys when they were in Southeast Asia. And they were turned because as soon as they came back to the United States, their careers were just on an upward trajectory. And we see that with Epstein. He comes from this humble origin, and then he's a teacher at Dalton, which is maybe the most prestigious high school in the United States of America, and he's not even a college graduate. So Epstein, we don't really know when Epstein was turned, but I think that the way that his career just shot up after he left Dalton is an indication that at some point he was turned. And in 1987, Les Wexner, whose name is also circled in the Black Book, who is a billionaire, he's head of L Brands, which was Victoria's Secret and Tommy Hilfiger and a number of other clothing lines. He was worth, at that point, about $4 billion. And in 1987, he gave Epstein the keys to his kingdom. He gave Epstein power of attorney over his entire empire. And at that point in 1987, you can see Epstein just, his star just rises and rises and rises. Why did Les Wexner, one of the richest men in the world, give Epstein the keys to his kingdom? According to Vanity Fair, Les Wexner gave Jeffrey Epstein the keys to his kingdom because he was lonely. That's what Vanity Fair wants us to believe.
Lonely. Okay.
He was lonely, yeah. That's what Vanity Fair says. Or maybe it was the New York Times. It was either the New York Times or Vanity Fair that said that, yeah, Les was lonely, and he decided to give Jeffrey Epstein power of attorney over his empire because he was lonely.
I mean, that is an answer. I'm not sure if it's an answer that explains his behavior.
but that's the kind of bullshit that the media has been selling us about Epstein. That's why Americans are perplexed about Epstein. They know that something went on.
Yeah.
And
I mean, well, so your book, about the Black Book came out in 2015.
Yes.
And it seems like, mainstream media initially wanted nothing to do with it. He wasn't even arrested until 2019.
Well,
but
actually,
even before,
he was arrested in 2008 initially.
I was going to say, I think I have it in my notes as 2006 for sex crimes against a minor in Florida.
That's when the initial investigation started with the Palm Beach Police Department.
Yeah, my point is that it's not as if this was unknown. Somebody considers myself to be a reasonable person. I don't understand, with the volume of data and the history of behavior with this individual, why this was not frontline news or headline news across the United States.
Well, it made it into the mainstream media prolifically. Every mainstream media outlet in this country has talked about the Black Book. Everyone.
Yeah.
But none of them have really talked about the Black Book the way that the Black Book should be talked about. And only one publication has given me credit for putting the Black Book on the internet. You would think that when this stuff started to come out about Epstein and people realized what a resource the Black Book was, that my phone would be ringing off the hook, but there were no calls. Vanity Fair called me. That was the only publication that called me.
Well, it would seem as if many of those organizations likely reported on it because they felt like they had to, and maybe to the minimum amount, as opposed to feeling like they wanted to and really diving into what it could mean for the power structure that exists in the United States.
Yeah, Americans are very naive about their political system, and it's truly unfortunate. I've been looking at, I wrote another book. I teamed up with someone who ran a gay escort service in Washington, D.C., and we wrote a book called Confessions of a D.C. Madam, The Politics of Sex, Lies, and Blackmail. And the intelligence would use his gay escorts to compromise closeted politicians. So I've been looking at this for quite some time. And Americans have a collective naivete about their political system. They do not think that their politicians are being blackmailed, which is truly unfortunate, because I've come to believe that the checks and balances within our government is blackmail. Our politicians, when you get to the national level, they're either blackmailed or they were willing to make Faustian pacts. And when I ultimately caught up with a blackmail photographer when I was researching the Franklin scandal, and I can prove that he was a blackmail photographer, I have police reports on him. I said, how does this work? Because I was still investigating, and I was still trying to get my mind around it. And he said, it's like you're on a yacht, and it's a beautiful yacht, and it's a beautiful day. And you can have anything on this yacht that you want. But if you decide to get off the yacht, the people on the yacht are going to make sure that you drown. And our politicians are on the yacht. And there's zero incentive for them to come out and say that they're being blackmailed.
Good morning, everybody. As you know, Change Agents is an Ironclad original. But what you may not know is that for over a decade, Ironclad has worked with brands and individuals to create world-class films, series, podcasts, and ad campaigns. In fact, I've been working with Ironclad for the past few years. I was introduced to them on a project through the Navy SEAL Foundation. I've worked with them on a variety of projects, even up here in Montana, long before they proposed the idea of Change Agents to me. They're the best in their field. And I say that because there are plenty of people out there looking for the best, looking for the cream of the crop, looking for the top of the triangle. And if you're looking for that, you need to look no further than Ironclad. If you ever need media by way of film, a series, podcasts, or ad campaigns, they have you covered. You can reach out today and follow them anywhere at This Is Ironclad, the ampersand, and then This Is Ironclad, or visit them online, thisisironclad.com. Again, www.thisisironclad.com. Can you unpack their relationship and kind of how they were trafficking, how they would find people and how they would traffic the victims, the actual mechanics of what it is they were doing?
It's interesting. Maxwell's father, Robert Maxwell, was a media baron, but he was also a spy for the U.S., the MI6, and also the Mossad. And Ghislaine Maxwell was his favorite child. He had, I believe there were 8 children in that family. Now, I've been told that Robert Maxwell brought Ghislaine and Jeffrey together. And he felt that it would be a wonderful match. The media says that what happened with Robert Maxwell was he plundered the retirement accounts of the workers in the various media that he owned. And he was ultimately busted for it. And I've been told that he had tried to blackmail the Mossad into giving him the money. But he ended up taking a leap from his yacht, and that's how he died. So the media says that Maxwell was feeling despondent because of her father's death and her father's criminality, and she moved to New York City, and there she met Jeffrey Epstein, and Jeffrey Epstein wanted her social connections, and Ghislaine Maxwell wanted his money, and it was a marriage made in heaven. I do not necessarily believe the media account, but I'm not exactly what to believe about how they met either. But what happened was Maxwell set up this machine, and she recruited, there were a number of procurers, and they recruited girls. I mean, that was a huge machine that Maxwell set up that was solely designed to procure underage girls. And there were a number of procurers. The New York Times, in addition to naming Ghislaine Maxwell, named 5 or 6 other procurers. And the amazing thing about the Maxwell trial is she was indicted on 1 count of child trafficking. Child trafficking carries a 15-year to life sentence. And she was indicted on 1 count. And the other procurers that we know about, that the New York Times wrote about, they weren't even indicted. Now, if we were really seeking justice in the Epstein case, what would happen was we would take the procurers, like the FBI or the Department of Justice dismantled the mafia. We would indict those procurers on multiple counts of child trafficking, where they'd be looking at 10 or 15 or 20 years in prison, because they certainly trafficked a lot of girls. And then they would roll over on the perps. If there was actual justice going on here, that's what would happen. But yeah, Maxwell set up this machine, and she conscripted other procurers, and they conscripted other procurers, and it was like a huge vacuum cleaner to find Jeffrey Epstein and his perverted pals, underage girls.
I mean, it's kind of a gross way to think about it, but if you had to put a ratio between Jeffrey and Ghislaine, is it Ghislaine or Ghislaine? Ghislaine. What would you put the ratio as far as the power of that network, the control of the network? Was it 50-50? Was Epstein more in charge of connecting the people that she found with those that were looking for that particular type of whatever you want to call it?
Maxwell was his number one lieutenant.
Okay.
Basically.
So do you think he was largely pulling the strings as far as the direction that they were trying to go, or do you think they did it more collaboratively?
Well, Maxwell oversaw the machine,
Mhm.
and Epstein provided these girls to the power brokers that he provided them to. And then Maxwell took part in that too. I mean, she was also complicit. But it was Epstein that was primarily pandering these girls to the power brokers.
So he created the body, and she fulfilled the role of the skeleton to make sure that it had the legs.
Yes. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the, I mean, probably the most recognizable thing I think the average person on the street would recognize from the Epstein story is the island. What are your thoughts on the island, the flight logs, and even I had heard recently, I might be butchering this a little bit, but didn't recently a senator block the subpoena for the flight logs to the island?
Yes. Well, the island is where a lot of that, I mean, the island was lawless. Epstein could do whatever he wanted at that island. He was the president of that island, essentially. There was Marsha Blackburn, a Republican senator, sought the flight logs of Jeffrey Epstein. Now, I've got flight logs. I've got flight logs from 1998 to 2006, and they certainly demonstrate a lot of names. But Marsha Blackburn wanted to subpoena the flight logs. But what happened there was the Democrats were going after the Supreme Court justices, especially Clarence Thomas, for his moral turpitude. And Blackburn was actually, it was kind of a quid pro quo, where if you're going to go after these conservative justices, I'm going to subpoena these flight logs. So basically what they were doing was, and ultimately the Senate Judiciary Committee, which was controlled by the Democrats, knocked down the subpoena, quashed the subpoena. But it's politicizing child abuse. I mean, she should have been asking to subpoena those flight logs because it was the right thing to do, not because the Democrats were going after a pervert like Clarence Thomas, who is very much a pervert and most likely compromised.
Do you believe that Epstein, I'm trying to think of the correct word I guess organization, Epstein's influence, does it touch equally both sides of the political aisle?
Mostly, I would say the Democrats, but the Franklin scandal, the book that I wrote about the trafficking network, it was primarily little boys that were pandered to Republicans, and Epstein was pandering little girls to Democrats. That seems, unfortunately, to be the partisan divide amongst our politicians.
So another thing with the island and a lot of the other properties was the hidden cameras.
Yes.
And obviously those cameras were there for recording, and I'm sure a multi-hour conversation could go, was it for the personal use of the people involved in those acts? Was it for blackmail? Was it for both of those things? Everything in between. Where do you think those recordings are now is the more interesting question to me.
Well, the FBI, when Epstein was arrested this last time, the FBI drilled his safe, and there were, depending upon the source, hundreds to thousands of DVDs. And some of them had names like Little Redacted plus Redacted. So there were probably compromise. There was probably a lot of compromise footage there, and probably child pornography too. So the FBI impounded everything, and it's gone into a black hole. I did a Freedom of Information Act request. I did not ask for the DVDs. I asked for reports on the DVDs. And as soon as Epstein killed himself, the federal government declared that the case was closed. So I felt, well, if the case is closed, I can, submit these Freedom of Information Act requests. So I submitted my Freedom of Information Act requests, and I was told that the case was ongoing.
Interesting.
So as Americans, we're going to have to press for that documentation to be revealed. We cannot let our government cover up child trafficking. I mean, it's a line in the sand that as Americans, we have to make sure that the government doesn't cross. Now, would you trust an individual or a group that was trafficking children?
No.
No one would trust an individual or a group that was trafficking children. So how can we have a baseline trust of our government if it's covering up crimes as heinous as trafficking children, which it certainly is in the Epstein case?
Well, and that brings me to some of the work that you just put out, the cleanup crew, where you talk about your conclusion. And I would love for you to explain to me how you got to this point where it was a COINTELPRO, a counterintelligence program. How did you come to this conclusion?
Well, David Boies, he is a big shot attorney. He's one of the most powerful attorneys in the world. And he represents a number of the Epstein victims. And David Boies has a very, very negative track record. He uses Black Cube. Black Cube is a company of retired Mossad mercenaries that do dirty deeds. They perform whatever dirty needs that need to be done. And David Boies, prior to representing Epstein victims, he had hired Black Cube to go after Rose McGowan, he was representing Harvey Weinstein, and he hired Black Cube to go after Rose McGowan, and Black Cube actually managed to wiggle into her life under assumed names and assumed identities. And Boies also used Black Cube against the New York Times when they were going to write an expose about that Harvey Weinstein was an inveterate rapist. And Elizabeth Holmes, who was the
Theranos,
the major grifter, he also used Black Cube to quash negative information about Elizabeth Holmes. And actually Boies was on the board. So David Boies likes to use Black Cube. He likes to destroy people. And when he was representing those victims, I had a strange feeling about it. And I just felt like something wasn't right there. So I started digging into to David Boies, and he conscripted an attorney named Stan Pottinger to help him with the litigation. Now, Stan Pottinger was an assistant U.S. Attorney General in the 60s and 70s. And if you needed a cover-up, Stan Pottinger was your man. I call Stan Pottinger the Forrest Gump of cover-ups, because wherever there's a major cover-up that's going on in the government during his time as an assistant attorney general, Stan Pottinger is there. He covered up with Kent State, those 4 college students that got murdered. Stan Pottinger impaneled a grand jury to look at the Kent State murders, and the grand jury declared that that there was no conspiracy, that the soldiers fired on the college students kind of impromptui. But a recording surfaced of one of the soldiers' commanders telling them to fire at the college students. And Pottinger had that tape of these soldiers being ordered to fire on the students, and yet he did not present it to the grand jurors in that grand jury that he impaneled. And because on the tape, voices heard saying, "Get set, point, fire." COINTELPRO was something else that Stan Pottinger covered up. It was the FBI's. I'll give you a summation of COINTELPRO. by the church hearings that was looking into government malfeasance in the mid 70s. And this is what the church hearings came to. COINTELPRO was spying on Americans and doing all kinds of things that were highly illegal. And this is what the church hearing had to say. The government operating primarily through secret informants, but also using other intrusive techniques such as wiretaps, microphone bugs, surreptitious mail opening, and break-ins has swept in vast amounts of information about the personal views, lives, and associations of American citizens. Groups and individuals have been harassed and disrupted because of their political views and their lifestyles. Investigations have been based on vague standards whose breadth made excessive collection inevitable. Unsavory and vicious tactics have been employed, including anonymous attempts to break up marriages, disrupt meetings, ostracize persons from their professions, and provoke target groups into rivalries that might result in deaths. So that was COINTELPRO. And Stan the Man Pottinger, the Forrest Gump of cover-ups, he was in charge of investigating COINTELPRO. And here's what he said about COINTELPRO to the Attorney General. The Civil Rights Division found no basis for making criminal charges against particular individuals or involving particular incidents. Although some of the acts reviewed appeared to amount to technical violations, the division concluded that without more information, prosecutive action would not be justified under its normal criteria. So he is saying that there wasn't enough information, but the church hearings gleaned 20,000 pages of FBI documents, took depositions from numerous FBI agents, and interviewed several COINTELPRO targets. So COINTELPRO was another cover-up of Stanley Pottinger. And when we get into the FBI went after the Black Panthers and the American Indian movement really, really hard. And there was a 2019 documentary that aired on PBS. It's called From Wounded Knee to Standing Rock, a reporter's journey. And it interviewed Tom Parker, a retired FBI agent who worked for COINTELPRO. And he said that the FBI had helped to fracture the American Indian movement. And he said, we wanted them to kill each other as we were in a war against AIM. And one of the tragic victims of COINTELPRO was Anne-Marie Aquash. She was a Micmac Indian and a member of AIM, and two members of AIM murdered her in December of 1975 after the FBI had disseminated rumors that she was a government informant. So ultimately, AIM took over Wounded Knee, and there was a Native American massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890, and AIM ultimately took over that village. And Pottinger was right on the scene there, and he was the quote unquote negotiator, and the Department of Justice under Pottinger's supervision brought a case against the 135 Native Americans that had occupied Wounded Knee, but they focused on Banks and Russell Banks and Dennis Means, who were head of the American Indian movement, and also the leaders of the town's takeover. And so Pottinger and the Justice Department planned to imprison Banks and Means for decades. But the trial judge discovered that the FBI had altered or suppressed key documents, committed illegal electronic surveillance, and had probably persuaded law enforcement officials in River Falls, Wisconsin, to drop rape and sodomy charges against the government's star witness. The judge also stated that the special agent in charge of the Minnesota division of the FBI, which covers 3 states, including South Dakota, where Wounded Knee is, had perjured himself on the stand, and he dismissed all charges against Banks and Means. So Pottinger wasn't very successful in covering that up. He played an integral role. There was a lot of information that came out about the Martin Luther King assassination that showed that James Earl Ray probably wasn't the assassin. And actually, the King family believed that James Earl Ray wasn't the assassin. And Pottinger launched an investigation and found that James Earl Ray was the lone nut. And it just goes on and on. This is kind of an interesting from the New York Times reported on CI Director Helms ordered the break-in into a photography studio that was owned by a former CIA employee. Pottinger oversaw the case and determined that Helms was innocent of civil rights violations. And this is, we're quoting Stan Pottinger now. I had lead responsibility in the case for a couple of months, said Pottinger. We have spared no resources, no time, and no effort. So he found that Helms did not commit any civil rights violations by having the CIA break into the business of an American citizen. But anyway, so Richard Helms had been called before the Church Commission, which I previously mentioned, and he told a lot of lies. And in that article that I'm quoting, Pottinger says, well, Helms' congressional testimony is under review for possible charges. So what Helms told a lot of lies before the Senate. He testified to Congress that the CIA had not funneled money to the opponents of Chilean President Salvador Allende, but the church hearings discovered that CIA had funneled $8 million to foes of Allende. Helms testified to Congress that the CIA had not conducted domestic surveillance, but nearly $250,000 of first-class letters were opened and photographed in the United States by the CIA during this period. And the CIA's Operation Chaos indexed 300,000 individuals in a CIA computer system and created 7,200 American files on 7,200 Americans and 100 domestic groups. And of course, the IRS developed files on 11,000 individuals and groups. Now, Stan Pottinger was going to get to the bottom of this because Richard Helms, the head of the CIA, had lied before Congress. I mean, that's pretty substantial to lie before Congress. I mean, people get multiple years. So this is what Helms got because Pottinger was so assiduous in executing his duties. Helms pled guilty. Helms pled no contest to two misdemeanors. He was fined $2,000 and given a 2-year suspended sentence. So when I'm calling Stan Pottinger the Forrest Gump of cover-ups, this is what he does. He covers things up for the government. And there are other cover-ups that I could get into, but I won't. And then when he was brought aboard by David Boies to help with the litigation, then I knew I really smelled a rat because Pottinger's definitely a CIA asset. I don't know if your viewers are familiar with the October surprise, but what happened there was the Ayatollah Khomeini took over Iran and deposed the Shah, who was our ally. And the Iranians collected a number of American hostages, like 60 of them. And the Reagan administration made a deal with the Iranians to hold on to the hostages until Reagan was elected, and then the government, under the auspices of the CIA, would sell them arms for their battle against Iraq, because Iran and Iraq were engaged in a war at that point. We were also selling arms to Iraq, but Pottinger was actually busted putting together an arms deal for the October surprise. And he was the lawyer for these two brothers that were importing and exporting arms, and he was busted on a tape, instructing them how to import arms and not get caught doing it. And this is a paragon, and who was in charge of this investigation was Rudolph Giuliani, and he's a paragon of integrity. And this is what Giuliani had to say. The investigation of Mr. Pottinger is still continuing, said U.S. Attorney Rudolph Giuliani. It would be unfair to make a judgment at this point. So what happened? Rudolph Giuliani and the Department of Justice lost the tapes that had Pottinger making these arms deals. So he was acquitted of making arms deals. And he was selling arms or aiding and abetting the selling of arms to an enemy state. So it would have been treason. I mean, he would have been, if all things were equal, he would have been arraigned for treason. So Stan Pottinger's a bad actor. And when he got involved with boys and representing these girls, I knew that something was really bad. That And Stan Ponger is definitely a CIA asset, and it only makes sense that the government would use a CIA op to cover up a CIA op, or an intelligence op to cover up an intelligence op, and that's what we're seeing with these Epstein victims and their attorneys. And the Epstein Victims Compensation Fund is a superlative tool for covering up crimes against the crimes committed by these Epstein perps, because as soon as those victims make a settlement with the Epstein Victims Compensation Fund, they cannot sue anybody. They cannot sue any other perpetrators. And also, I know 2 esteemed therapists that had clients who said that they were molested by Epstein and his cronies when they were under 10 years old. And both of them were denied settlements from that fund. And the therapist, and one of them is a highly esteemed therapist, nationally renowned, said that she believed that her client didn't get a settlement because the cover story on Epstein is that none of the girls were under 14 years old. But because these 2 girls had been 10 years or younger, that's the reason why they felt that they didn't get a settlement. So that's the corruption that's presently going on with the Epstein cover-up and these attorneys.
Is it your opinion, based on your research, that Epstein was a mechanism of the intelligence agencies?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. You've got a U.S. attorney being told to stand down. Only a president or an attorney general can do that. His house in Florida, his house in New York, and also his island was wired for audiovisual blackmail. The CIA or the FBI and Department of Justice got all those DVDs. They definitely know who was on those DVDs and who was compromised. And then you've got these attorneys with intelligence connections, or certainly one with intelligence connections, making sure that this cover-up is sealed hermetically. And the Epstein Victims Compensation Fund is a superlative tool to aid and abet the cover-up, because those victims that sign and get money from that fund, they cannot sue any other of their perpetrators. I mean, so that fund is doing something that the government couldn't do. It's preventing those victims from suing other perpetrators.
In your opinion, what would you consider the odds of Epstein actually having killed himself?
You know, I don't like to speculate about that, because I think it's kind of a smokescreen. I mean, there's certainly a lot of anomalies that happened that night in that jail. But the issue isn't whether or not he killed himself. Some news organization approached me a couple of months ago and asked me if I wanted to be part of a segment that they were putting together. Did Epstein kill himself or not? And I said, no, I don't want to be part of that. And I said, this is a much more interesting story. These attorneys covering up for intelligence. And they wanted to just regurgitate whether or not Epstein killed himself. They didn't want to cut new ground with the information that I've just provided you.
Yeah. So 2 final questions for you, because I want to be respectful of your time. I'll lay them both out and you can answer in whatever direction you want to. What can be done? What can anybody do to help these victims of the Epstein organization? That would be the first question. And number 2 would be, what can people do to continue to force this issue to the top until a cover-up like this at least has the top of it blown off and this information continues to come out?
So we've started an organization called EpsteinJustice.com. EpsteinJustice.com. And we have an advisory board of very esteemed therapists that have worked with trafficking victims. We've got an Epstein trafficking victim, and we also have a very solid staff. And what we're doing is we're not going to let this go. We want 2 things. We want these perpetrators we want accountability for the perpetrators, and we want accountability for the government. We want a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that's going to give us accountability. It's not about the right. It's not about the left. It's about doing what's right. Child trafficking is a heinous crime, and our government should not be in the business of covering up child trafficking. And right now, the left and the right are so polarized. I think that this Epstein justice is the only issue that can bring the right and left together. That's something that we can agree on, is that we need accountability for these perpetrators and that we need accountability for the government. The government should not be in the business of covering up child trafficking. That's something that we have to make sure doesn't happen again. But I also believe that if we drill into Epstein, we will really understand the rot within our government. The congressional approval rating is 17%. So it's very obvious to most Americans that our legislators are not working in our best interests. The bills that they pass are making the rich richer and the poor poorer, causing unbelievable wealth polarization. Our constitutional rights are just being trampled upon regarding domestic spying. Our legislators are not working in our best interest. And I think that if we drill into this issue, we will come across the cesspool that is causing many of the problems in our country. And we will really start to understand why the congressional approval rating is 17% and why our legislators are not working in our best interest.
What final thoughts would you like to leave the listeners with?
Well, you don't have to be passive. You can join us at EpsteinJustice.com, and you can help us clean out the government. You can be cynical and say, well, that's just how it's going to go. But do you want your children growing up in this world? I mean, it's only going to get worse when this kind of perfidiousness just rots our government. So we need people to join together, right or left, it doesn't matter. We need people to join together with Epstein Justice, and we really need to affect change. We need to rectify this before our government ultimately ends up destroying us.
I appreciate your time. I mean, to say that you unpacked a lot, and then I think that will leave people with hopefully a desire to continue to do their research and dive into.
So what do you guys think? You think Epstein was CIA? Gee, I don't know. Of course he was. My friends, we have an illegal criminal government, and so many of us act like we have to respect the government. Well, the IRS is going to come get us. You mean the corrupt fucking IRS? Well, what about the FBI? Oh, you mean the corrupt FBI? Or should we worry about the CIA? Or should we worry about the SEC? Fuck all these criminals. I will not respect nor give any authority to any of these pieces of fucks. I don't respect criminals who hurt children. I don't respect any of these people. And I will not give them any authority over me. Fuck you. Come get it. This is why I don't understand how people are worried about the fucking government. These people are garbage. Pure criminal garbage. Why the fuck are you afraid of a bunch of child molesting piece of shit? That's why the FBI showed up at my house twice. Yeah, fuck you. That's what I have to say to the FBI. Fuck you. Now, on to a happier point. We got about 45 minutes left, folks. Here we go, my friend. You're about to see and hear some wild shit. You ready?
All right, Billy Carson, thank you for coming back, man. You are a popular guy.
Hey, thank you, man. I'm glad I made it.
So what have you been up to, man? You've been traveling the world. You've been in all over Egypt. You've been all over. You went to India, right?
Cambodia.
Cambodia. Yeah.
Went to Cambodia. We took a huge tour in Egypt. We took 2 tours of people to Egypt in October. So I stayed there the whole month. And it was about 140 people, 2 tours, all throughout Egypt, Luxor and Dendera, Abydos, everywhere you can think of. Took them on a lot of private visits, hidden chambers, hidden doors that have been sealed for 30, 40, even 50 years. One place was sealed for over 100 years. We took them down there, going underneath pyramids, underneath hidden shafts and different crypts at different locations that have been sealed. So giving them a real private experience. And then right after that, 2 weeks later, taking another 20 people on a private tour of Cambodia, Angkor Wat. Took them to the largest temple complex in the world, which people kind of don't really understand the power of Angkor Wat. The moat that goes around the temple itself, more mass than the blocks that built the Great Pyramid was removed to make just the moat around Angkor Wat. Think about that for a minute. More mass than the Great Pyramid was moved. And the way that they set it up, they knew how to capture the rainwater coming down from the mountain to create a moat that could sustain itself and also irrigate fields for growing crops all at the same time from one flow of water. You can't do that type of digging and moving of mass if you don't know the end result. So you're talking about the fact that these people had foreknowledge, they had advanced knowledge and advanced engineering skills to know beforehand that before they move this kind of mass, the result's going to work out for them. You don't just say, well, let's try to move this mass and see what happens. You know that it's going to work because you have foreknowledge.
It was engineered, right?
Engineered.
Yeah.
Engineered.
This is Angkor Wat.
Yeah.
Wow, man.
Massive, massive temple complex.
So is that the body of water right before it where they removed?
Mm-hmm. That's the moat in front of it that goes around it. Just like, you see the old castles in the middle and the moat protects it.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And there's over 1,000 temples there in Cambodia.
When was Angkor Wat allegedly built?
This is a good question. They're trying to say that Angkor Wat was built less than 1,000 years ago, which to me is almost laughable. The king that took ownership and claimed that he built Angkor Wat, he only lived for 45 years. That's number one. Number two, you've had to mature to a point where you can make decisions like building a massive temple complex like that. And I doubt that with the amount of ornate glyphs that almost outdo all glyphs throughout entire Egypt on one building can be done within the time frame of his lifespan. So I seriously doubt. I believe that he inherited what was already there, that his team went and cleaned it up, removed the jungle, cleared it out, maybe even repaired or replaced some hieroglyphs, branded his name on the building. But I seriously doubt that he's the founder and the builder of Angkor Wat. I believe that he inherited what was already there.
Hey guys, I want to ask you a quick favor. Over the last few months, almost 70% of the viewers of this podcast are not subscribed to the channel. The most important common denominator that allows me to keep creating these podcasts every single week is you hitting that subscribe button below the videos. I want to thank every single one of you who watches and supports these podcasts. I would not be able to do it without you. Please hit that subscribe button if you enjoy it. Now back to the show.
We hiked about 50 miles in the jungles of Angkor Wat, going to all the different temples. Really? It's a lot of, when you go on our tours, I mean, you got, it's 150 miles we did in Egypt alone in October. But these sites are amazing. You can, there's a mountain that we hiked up. When you get to the top of the mountain, they shaved the top of the mountain and turned it into a sleeping Buddha. And I just saw one image there from Angkor Wat where they had that famous movie was filmed there. I think it was the Temple of Doom, or the one with the young lady. What's her name again? Laura Croft.
Oh, Tomb Raider?
Tomb Raider was filmed there.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Tomb Raider.
No shit.
Yeah. Great place, beautiful. Now, hard to get to. It's about 38 hours flying from Florida to get to Angkor Wat. It's hard to get there, I'm not going to lie.
Now, Cambodia is right between Vietnam and Laos, right?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, you got to land. The best place to land is land in Bangkok and then fly from Bangkok, a 1 hour flight to Cambodia. So you're going to book a flight.
What is that right there?
That is Ta Prohm. Now, here's what's very interesting. Boy, I got to get you this image for this podcast. This image here of Ta Prohm, this face. There's a very similar face on an amazing anomaly discovered on Mars. So that face right there, extremely, extremely similar to a rock anomaly discovered on Mars by Perseverance rover. I'm sorry, not Perseverance, by Curiosity rover.
Curiosity rover?
Curiosity rover.
On Mars.
On Mars.
Yeah, it's Mars is such a crazy. I just had a guy on here like 2 weeks ago. He's an astrophysicist.
Yeah.
Brian Keating, and he is kind of a little bit cynical about life beyond Earth. He doesn't see, his claim is there's no evidence. There's no hard evidence of life. And he made the analogy. He's like, Danny, what if I told you that there was a planet in the Goldilocks zone of a star on a solar system that was teeming with life. Yeah. And then there was a planet very close to it that could easily inhabit life that was also in the Goldilocks zone. Would you say there was any life or absolutely no life? And you would say, of course there would be life.
Yeah.
And he's like, well, okay, the perfect analogy to that is Earth and Mars.
Yes.
Earth has teeming with life, and Mars, there is zero evidence of life. And it's kind of bizarre.
Yeah. It's really bizarre. A lot of the new science data has come out about Mars now. So first they were just saying Mars was a cold, dry rock. So I kept saying, if it's just a cold, dry rock, why are we spending literally collectively on as a planet trillions of dollars to go there?
Right.
Trillions. Why would you keep spending money to go? Who's approving these checks? Then when I saw India raise $3 million to send a satellite there, I said, there's something really going on. When you look into the new science data, you find out that first they were saying cold, dry rock. Now they're saying flowing water. Now they're saying lakes, hectares worth of lakes of water. Now they're also saying it's salt water, brine, right? And they're saying now that, wow, we can see where rivers were and oceans were, and there's still huge pockets of massive amounts of liquid water. And then all of a sudden they're saying now, before they were saying no oxygen, now they're saying, oh, there's oxygen. If you're like 10 feet or below, it's almost breathable. It would be like being about 14,000 feet above sea level, like being in Tibet, so to speak, or the top of Machu Picchu, which we can acclimate to just fine.
Right.
Then they were saying, no, your DNA would unravel because of the radiation, because there's no magnetic field. Then they're saying now, all of a sudden, wait a minute, we do discover a magnetic field. But even though it's a little bit weaker, but because of the planet's rotation on its axis, which is about the same speed as Earth.
Right.
And it's moving around the sun, it creates something called bow shock that bends the cosmic rays around the planet, preventing them from getting down to the lower levels of the surface, allowing DNA to flourish on the surface. So we keep hearing all these things about Mars, and then the deeper you look into some of the images on their own servers, you start seeing things that look like plant life, that look organic, and then a lot of structures that resemble things from ancient civilizations, quite frankly. But now when you read the ancient Sumerian tablets, you discover that they had this working class called the Igigi. And in the Atrahasis epic and the Epic of Gilgamesh And in the Enuma Elish and the 7 tablets of creation, these Igigi beings were working on Mars and Earth at the same time, building 2 breakaway civilizations concurrently. And they were tasked with that load. And they got mad about doing that amount of work. They wanted to stop working, but they worked for about 200,000 years before they revolted against Enki and Lil and Anu. But the fact that you can see the similarities on Earth and the similarities with what looks like potentially collapsed structures on Mars, it tells you there's one architect or one architectural plan that came from one place. Both places have the same architecture. In Avebury in the UK, there's a place in Avebury where you can pull down an ordnance map. It's close to Stonehenge. If you take that ordnance map, and I'll send you a copy of it, you can overlay it on top of Cydonia, and it perfectly aligns the mound, which is an artificial mound built and massive amount of land moved to build a mound there, and 2 tracks and paths that lead up to more anomalies that were man-made on Earth. When you overlay it on top of Cydonia, the image from Cydonia, it matches those anomalies perfectly. So who made a replica of an area of Cydonia on Earth? And Cydonia means Cairo. So
Really?
yeah. So we're talking about the same builders.
I was just reading, I just finished rereading this book called Area 51 by Annie Jacobson. And she was talking about in Nevada, the atomic test sites where they eventually stopped detonating bombs in the atmosphere and they started doing them in like these vertical shafts. And they were detonating thermonuclear bombs in vertical shafts, like beneath the desert. And that's also where they did training for the Apollo missions out in those deserts. For those guys, they had to get geared up and like and reenact or like rehearse their missions.
Yeah.
And what's crazy is the craters that are made from those thermonuclear bombs detonated underground are exactly like the craters on the moon. They look just like that.
Yes.
And that was one of the crazy things that Buzz Aldrin and Edgar Mitchell noticed.
Yeah. When you look at the moon images, and I've studied the moon, I mean, countless amount of hours. I've got so many moon images. There's a famous dome structure that I discovered that made it onto TV on 2 different shows, because it's undeniable, a dome structure on the moon. Now, that came from the Apollo 11 video, so it wasn't an old Photoshopped image or anything anybody could touch up. It came directly from the archives, from a downloaded video stream of the limb coming back to the command module. Now, what's interesting is when you look at the moon, those craters are never in any particular angle. In other words, if I'm free floating through space and I've got things coming at me, it would hit an angle and then make a track until it comes to a point where it stops, and then it would create a crater. All these things are straight down, perfectly straight down. There's nothing that slid and moved into a particular angle to create an implosion. It's all an explosion. It looks like all implosions, like what you're talking about. You have these craters that seem to be all almost the same depth. How is that even possible?
Yeah, that's crazy.
And so I went to usgs.gov and I downloaded some imagery there. I sent it to a friend of mine who runs Mars Anomalies. He's an expert on looking at these usgs.gov ground penetrating images. These came from the Arecibo before it collapsed and broke, a few years ago.
From what?
The Arecibo satellite array that we had in Puerto Rico.
Okay.
It's no longer functioning, but we have images from it still. There was one of the largest satellites on Earth that were able to take radio images of planets and so forth. Well, we used it and pointed it at the moon. And guess what we found out? Underneath the surface of the moon, there appears to be some gigantic, what we can only assume might be metallic or beam-like structures 30 meters beneath the surface. So is it that they only stop there because that's as far as you can go? I mean, we don't know. But what's interesting is they all seem to almost have the same depth. And there doesn't seem to be much of a debris around the rim. Where did all that debris go? There's enough gravity to pull it back down, but it just seems to be gone. So what are those? Now, we have a black box audio, which I'll send to you so you can play this. In the black box audio from Apollo 11, one of the astronauts, I believe it was Neil, said, look at those convex domes down there, or convex craters, I believe he says. Now, convex, I believe he said convex.
Convex means it's like this.
Yes, which doesn't make any sense. Then he says, I bet the people down there never get out. And that's on the redacted, printed statement. They didn't redact that statement, and it's also in the audio. So that's made it into documentaries that I've done because I discovered that. So I'll send you a copy of that. You can play it in this podcast. But what's interesting is that's a pretty blunt statement to make, and knowing that it's being recorded, and then they actually let it stay in the documents and the audio, the black box audio from Apollo 11.
Can you find that on YouTube?
You might be able to.
Okay.
You might be able to. But I know I have the download link in my Anunnaki group.
Okay.
That I can get it. Yeah. Pretty crazy.
That's very crazy,
Yeah.
man.
And I think I have the link directly to the source on NASA.gov as well.
I just had a guy on my podcast about a month ago. He I don't know if you've ever heard of him. His name's Chris Bledsoe. And he has these crazy experiences where he sees orbs all the time. Like he goes out into his backyard and he has these orbs that follow him, and he films them and he posts them on Instagram.
Wow.
And nobody knows what they are.
Wow. That's interesting.
It's really interesting. And he believes it's spiritual. He believes they're angels. And he's got this great book called UFO of God, where he talks about his like life story and how he started witnessing these orbs, and then he started seeing like this apparition of a lady. Anyways, he started getting attention from NASA, and one day a guy from this is all like documented and confirmed, like he is like the most credible. The crazy thing about him is his story is so phenomenal, unbelievable. I mean, post these videos every day. He came down here. We went to the beach, and he summoned these fucking orbs from the beach. I watched this shit come out of the ocean.
Wow.
And it's on video.
Wow.
It's not just like hearsay. We literally filmed it.
That's incredible.
And the craziest thing about it is that there's all these people from NASA, CIA, and the Pentagon that started showing up at his house and talking to him and interviewing him. One guy, his name was Hal Povenmire, who showed up at his house one day and said, "Hey, is Chris Bledsoe home? I just wanted to hope to talk to him for a little bit." And his son answered the door and let the guy in. And he's like, "I just drove from Cape Canaveral, Florida." The guy, and he drove to I think they were in Fayetteville, North Carolina.
Wow.
So he drove from Cape Canaveral, North Carolina, and sat there and interviewed him and his family for hours.
Wow.
And kept coming back over like a couple times a year to ask him questions. And he was trying to confirm if the guy's story was full of shit or not. Started interviewing people around him, family members, friends, other people who claimed to be witnesses of his event. And long story short, this guy becomes like close friends to the family. And this guy, Hal, turns out he was the guy who was in charge of mapping the moon for the Apollo missions. And I guess one day they were having dinner, and he asked him, he's like, "Hal," he's like, "is what they say about the moon true? What's the craziest thing that you could tell me about the moon?" And he's like, he asked him about like the dark side of the moon. Like, is there stuff on the dark side of the moon? And he goes, "There are structures that are ancient on the dark side of the moon. And that's all we know about them." He's like, "There's structures there and they're ancient." He didn't tell him anything more than that. And they're shaped like mushrooms.
Wow. Well, I downloaded a lot of images from the Clementine mission. So I was looking into the moon, and I discovered a prior top secret mission called Clementine. And I said, I wonder if there's any images on this. And they had been declassified. So I got the images from NASA.gov. Now, what's interesting about these Clementine images, when I saw the name Clementine mission, I already knew right away what was going to happen. This thing never came back. Remember that song? "Oh, my darling Clementine, you were lost and gone forever." I already put 2 and 2 together. And sure enough, by the time I got done with the end of this document, this thing had supposedly hit something on the far side of the moon, and it never returned, but it transmitted all this data, gigabytes of data of images, crazy images. So this Clementine was a low lunar orbiting mission that went to the far side of the moon and documented that there are structures on that side. If you remember during one of the Apollo missions, when the astronauts were orbiting the moon, they got to the far side, you were out of radio communication range. But all of a sudden, somebody hacked into their comms from that side, and it sounded like music. It sounded like people chanting in their ears, and they were all freaking out. It's on the black box.
Right.
"What? You hear this? You hear this? What is it? What is that?" And it filled up the whole capsule until they got back in the communications range again. Then they got reconnected to Houston. So there's something going on that far side of the moon.
It's very freaky.
Yeah.
And it's a fascinating thing to dive into, but it's like
The guy with the orbs is incredible. There's
his story's insane.
because there's somebody in my document, my Black Knight satellite documentary.
Yes.
And he talks about the orbs. And he says that he was able to write some type of a code and frequency that was able to hack into some of them, that they're controlled, he calls them technology, and says they're like advanced probes from another civilization, and that they're watching us utilizing these orbs. That's what he claims.
Yeah. This guy, so I had another friend, like a CIA friend of mine, a former CIA guy who is now doing this show on History Channel. And they brought Chris, the Bledsoe, onto an episode of it. It was called Beyond Skinwalker Ranch.
Oh.
And they like put this crazy contraption on his head where it measured his brain waves, an EEG.
Mm-hmm.
And they like set up all these crazy cameras all over the ground to try to film these orbs and figure out what they were. And they basically, they couldn't figure it out. They weren't satellites. They measured, or they tracked the footage against like satellite mapping and FAA chart, like FAA records or whatever, like where the planes were flying and where the satellites were.
Yeah.
And it confirmed it wasn't planes and it wasn't satellites. So they still haven't figured out like what exactly they are, but he has this crazy like spiritual biblical story of what it is. And he saw this woman. He's had these visions of this woman who told him there was going to be a great change when what is the star? The star of Regulus lines up in the gaze of the Sphinx, she said to him.
Beltaglis?
Huh?
Is it Beltaglis?
No, it was the star of Regulus, which is the heart of the Leo constellation, or like the brightest star in the Leo constellation.
Okay, gotcha.
So when that rises in the morning, on the dawn, in the gaze of the Sphinx, she said there would be a great shift in humanity or something like that. Right? That was what it was.
It's
Steve?
possible, the
star of Regulus.
Yeah, star of Regulus. Okay, Leo. Well, the Great Sphinx is aligned with the constellation of Leo, but where it was 2 processional periods ago, 36 to 38,000 years ago, the same time that Thoth claims to have built the Great Pyramid in Egypt. And his father told him to build the Sphinx and put his face on it. Now, the face was changed later on to his nephew's face. That's why the face doesn't fit the body. It was never the face of a lion. And there's other sphinxes.
It was never the face of a lion.
Never the face. There's other sphinxes in Egypt with much smaller, but with human faces on them. When Thoth,
and it's proportional heads to the body?
Proportional.
Okay.
That's right. So Thoth and his brother, Amun-Ra, they were clashing. And then his father said, Enki said, look, you go to the other side of the planet. You go build something. He went to Mesoamerica, built the whole Teotihuacan, Chichen Itza, Koba, all those locations. That's why Teotihuacan is a mirror of Giza. Right, the 3 pyramids lined with Orion. The pyramid of the sun is the same exact size of the base of the Great Pyramid at Egypt, and the height is exactly 50%. Both are built on top of aquifers. It's the same architect, and so he's doing that. And his brother takes over. Early of his, they rule on processions of the equinox, but his brother took over before Pisces fully came in, and he then refaced it to his son's face. So that's the nephew of Thoth, the Atlantean. Face is on the Sphinx, or the son of Marduk, aka Amun-Ra. That's the face that's on the Sphinx right now. It was recarved.
Marduk's son.
Yes.
Is the face on there right now.
That's correct.
And it was originally the face of who?
Thoth. He's known as Hermes. He's known as Tahuti in Egypt, in Africa. Jehuti. In Australia, he's known as Thothamabi. He's known as Odin. He's, to the Greeks and the Romans and so forth, he's known as Mercury. I mean, he's Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica, Lord Pakal, Kukulkan, Viracocha, many names, same person.
That's Thoth?
Yeah, the first emperor of China, Wang Di, same person.
Yeah, your book, The Epic of Humanity, the one that you and Matt LaCroix did, is fascinating. I read it last night. I love the way you guys broke down the history of the Anunnaki.
Thank you, man.
It's fascinating. So maybe we should talk about that right now. I know we touched on it briefly on the last podcast, but it's fascinating how there's all of these ancient tablets. Like the Enuma Elish, or like the Emerald tablets, and all those tablets around the world that are in these museums that all have such similar stories of these 2 gods who were here, and they created demigods that were supposed to terraform the earth is what they were doing. And then they got fed up, they got overworked, and they went on strike. So they created humans.
Yes, that's it. That's it. Now it's a little bit deeper than that. Obviously that's very surface, but that's true.
So when did this, according to these tablets, when did this start?
Yeah. It started around 450,000 years ago, the breakaway civilization.
450,000 years ago.
That's when they arrived on this planet. They came here about 450,000 years ago. At the time that they arrived, Alalu, who made it through the hammered bracelet, which is the asteroid belt. At that time, the asteroid belt was still very chaotic because the asteroid belt is an exploded planet. An exploded planet that used to have the name of Tiamat. Before Earth even existed, you had Mercury, Venus, which was in the position we're in now, and then you had Tiamat. Earth wasn't here yet. Tiamat had 2 moons. It probably had more than that, but the 2 we know of is the moon we have now and Mars. Mars can be backtracked. Even modern mainstream astrophysicists agree that Mars was probably a moonlet that orbited a much larger planet based on the weird elliptical orbit that it has.
Really?
Yeah. So what happened was you have our moon and you have Mars, a habitable moon, orbiting Tiamat. Tiamat in the Enuma Elish, the 7 tablets of creation, literally gets impacted by another object that was orbiting another star. So our solar system had gravitationally attracted a rogue solar system, so to speak. And there was a collision that happened which made Tiamat explode. When Tiamat exploded, now here's something interesting before I go that far. In the text, it says that Tiamat's glory rivaled the sun. It was a water-bearing planet with land and life. Now, who wrote that? How did they know that this planet had land and life and that it rivaled the sun's glory? That when the sun shined on it, it beamed back because it had so much water and it was so massive. It was 6 times larger than Earth. Somebody had a view of this planet from somewhere in the solar system. But anyway, so it exploded. A huge chunk swung away with all that land and organic material and recoalesced as the Earth. The moon then was put into place to balance the wobble.
Right.
Mars grabbed its own crazy elliptical orbit around the sun. That's why we can only rendezvous with Mars when it's in, I think it's in perigee every 2 years.
Right.
Because of its weird distances that it that it has with orientation to Earth.
Right.
And so Earth has weird anomalies inside of it that go back hundreds of millions of years. And people are like, how did this 200 million year old hammer, because they can tell by the depth in these mines, how did this pottery get down here? 300 million year old piece of pottery. It's not from Earth. It's when Earth was part of Tiamat. You're looking at a relic from a whole other civilization when we were part of another planet. Nobody's talking about this. That's the next thing that I'm going to be talking about in my next book. We're talking about Earth.
They found artifacts that...
Oh, yeah. We've got artifacts that date back 300, 400, 500 million years.
Like which artifacts specifically?
There's vases, there's hammers, or things that look like hammers, or tools that have been discovered deep in these mine shafts. And you can tell the years by the depth of the mine.
Are you referring to some of those vases that Ben Van Kerkwijk has been measuring?
I'm not sure. I don't know about him measuring anything, but you can look these up. They're mainstream artifacts.
So Ben Van Kerkwijk, he has been working with Chris Dunn, the guy who wrote the Giza Power Plant.
Oh, yeah, he's powerful. Chris Dunn, I love him.
Yeah. He was here a couple months ago.
Wow.
And we did crazy 2-part podcast. It was fascinating. His son is an astrophysicist astrophysicist. His son is an aerospace engineer at Rolls-Royce.
Right. Yeah.
And so Ben was able to get his hands on a couple of these dynastic Egyptian vases. And they brought them to Rolls-Royce, and Ben and Chris Dunn's son and their whole team of engineers put this thing in this laser device that measured it within like 1/1,000,000th of a centimeter. Right. And they found out, I mean, Stephen, you can pull up the diagrams of it that they found, but they measured it, and they measured each angle and compared each surface against each other. And they found out that thing was perfectly symmetrical within less than a human hair.
Yeah, it's less than a micron.
And it's made out of granite, one of the hardest stones on Earth.
Right.
And what they figured out was there's no way they could have made this without a computer.
That's right. You need a computer, and you need a tool that we don't have right now to make these fine holes. You see those indentions there where the handles are?
Right.
to do that, and to even do that rim on stone that solid and that hard,
Right.
you need a very special type of tool. We would need
Find the
something-
article, Steve. The
we would
article
need
that
a-
we pulled up last time with Ben was really good.
we would need a large, giant diamond bit. And
Right.
we'd have to have a lot of water and things for cooling. Whatever they used was way more sophisticated than what we have.
Mhm. And that vase is like it's almost as thin as the cover of your book.
Yeah.
But like
Right.
to be able to do that without breaking that is
Right.
so incredibly difficult to do.
They're super experts at stonework. I remember I just came back from Egypt and I was inside the Serapeum, which I believe is one of Enki's halls of Amenti, the rejuvenation chambers. Those things didn't have bulls in them. They never found a bull in any of them.
Right.
That's bull crap.
Right.
But they're so clean on the inside, and the inside of those boxes, those magnificent, 100-ton granite boxes is polished.
Right.
Smooth as glass.
Right.
Perfectly 90-degree angles. I was using our, the phone. You can do the level. The level was perfect everywhere you looked. And so to do this type of work, this fine work, and even that megalithic work, it takes a very special skill and a very special understanding of stonework and a special type of advanced tool, along with some type of computer. You need something guiding it. It's not done by hand. Nobody's sitting there with their hand doing
Can't
this.
do that with copper chisels.
No chicken bones and copper chisels.
No.
This is real advanced technology that we still can't duplicate today, which is pretty incredible. Yeah, that's mind-boggling.
Yeah. So one of the things Chris Dunn was pointing out about these vases and about those boxes in the Serapeum is he was like comparing it to because he's a former aerospace engineer himself. Yeah. He was comparing what he was saying is you don't need perfection unless there's a function.
Yes.
Right. You don't need to make something that precise unless it serves a purpose.
Right.
So that's what the whole thing is like. What was the purpose of these boxes, or what was the purpose of these vases? Why were they that perfect just because it was easy?
Right.
Like, is it easy for them to make stuff with that perfection that out of that kind of stone, or was it very, very important that it had to be that perfect to achieve a certain function?
There's a couple of options. One, and it could be a combination of three. One is philosophical.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Rocket Money. Ancient civilizations on our planet were a paragon of organization, never wasting their resources on the unnecessary. Every grain of wheat was accounted for, every block of limestone used for the pyramids was meticulously planned, and every drop from the Nile River was carefully accounted for. If the ancient Egyptians lived among us today, how would they be sure they weren't wasting money? They would certainly be users of Rocket Money. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that embodies this ancient wisdom in a modern tool. It helps you find and cancel all those unwanted subscriptions with ease. Just imagine if the Pharaoh had the power to cancel chariot maintenance monthly with a single tap. And it's not just about canceling subscriptions. It's about monitoring and controlling your spending. You can see all your subscriptions in one place. No more digging through bank statements or suffering these long, grueling calls with customer service people. This is a tool even the most organized Anunnaki god would have envied. They'll even work on getting you refunds on subscriptions that you haven't used. They're very skilled negotiators. Rocket Money can potentially lower your bills by up to 20%. Just snap a photo of your bill, send it to them, and they will handle the rest. The bottom line is Rocket Money has already helped over 5 million users save an average of $720 per year. That's over $500 million in canceled subscriptions. Don't let your money get buried and hidden like the Dead Sea Scrolls. Take control and cancel all those unwanted subscriptions by visiting rocketmoney.com/DJP. Remember, that's rocketmoney.com/DJP. Simplify your financial life today, the same way our ancient ancestors would if they could. Back to the show.
When I went to Cambodia, not this time, but the time before, I was fortunate enough to talk to some monks, and the monk was talking to me and showing me these young monks that he had, like they were kids. I didn't even know they started as kids, and they were cleaning and sweeping. And I was like, man, the floor is already clean. The garbage is already, you got them cleaning it again. I was just joking with me. He says, no, we have to do everything to perfection. Even if it's taking out the trash or sweeping the floor, it must be done to perfection. Has some advanced race advanced to the point of philosophical concepts that everything must be perfected, If you think about living your life doing everything to a level of perfection, how much more improved we would all be if that was our main focus, perfecting everything. Now, not becoming OCD, but actually working and focusing on whatever task that we're doing it at our best and highest level, right? And so that could be one thing. The other thing is that the technology, whether it's some type of a nano tool or whatever they had, it made it so easy for them. So it could be a combination of that because of their drive for perfection philosophically, that they've created a technology that creates this level of perfection so that they now eliminate one process of overthinking. We have the tech that can make it just like it's supposed to be. And the third is the function. All of these crystal, granite, and diorite crystal boxes and vases, they all have a certain level of higher background radiation coming out of them. So if you take a Geiger counter to these things, you'll find they're still emitting radiation. If you go with a Geiger counter to those Serapeum boxes, you'll see radiation levels way higher than background. Oh,
wow.
And so when I was there the last time, I took people on a private visit into a sealed door. We couldn't get in the door because the director of the site forgot that we were coming that day. So he called our guide and gave the approval for us to smash the lock. So we smashed the lock. He said, as long as you buy another one. So I said, we'll buy another one. We went into the room, the biggest box you've ever seen, 3 times bigger than any box in the regular Serapeum. And it's got a radioactive sticker on it, letting you know it's radioactive. Whoa. So all these things, the function is energy. These things are transmitting a specific type of energy, radioactive energy, but also some type of other exotic energy, I believe, is combined. And there's one other thing to this. They're all mostly crystal. 50%, 40 to 60% is crystal. Now, crystals are sentient living beings in my personal research. They can replicate, they can communicate, they can send and receive information. They're alive. They can grow on their own. They can duplicate. So I believe that another thing that they did was they used stone that had crystal because in their perception, they were creating living machines. Okay, so the statues, they were alive. These vases, they're alive. Those boxes, they're all alive because they're loaded with so many tons of crystal.
What is it? Is it quartz crystal or
quartz crystal?
Quartz.
Yeah.
What do you think the purpose of those boxes were?
Oh, halls of Amenti. So if you read the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, my first book, Compendium of the Emerald Tablets, I break it all the way down.
Okay.
He had these boxes in these underground halls that were discovered underneath the Great Pyramid, exactly where he says they were in his tablets. And in these halls, and it was just one of the locations. They had them all over the earth. They would actually create their own bodies. They said we fashioned our own bodies. So they either take a stem cell and turn it into a clone of themselves, but they didn't take other bodies. They said they made their own. And then they would put a body in a rejuvenation chamber, which is the box. And then they would transfer their consciousness from the body that's been used up into the newer body. And they said we would walk amongst men, but unlike a man. And so they would be here walking around, and you wouldn't even know that they just been transferring their mind from body to body. And each one of those boxes had bodies in them, and the body would sit there for 100 years, and they would walk amongst men in the body for 100. And Thoth says he did it 100 times 10. So if you take 100 times 10 plus the 100 years of each body sitting in the box, you're talking 100,000 years potentially. So you're talking about beings that achieve the level of immortality, not because of their gods, but because of they had advanced technology that allowed them to transfer their consciousness into another body.
Wow.
It calls the halls of Amenti. In the Serapeum, I believe, is one of the halls of Amenti, but that one belongs to Enki, Thoth's father.
That is bizarre. Chris, I was trying to get it out of Chris when he was here. I'm like, what were he's like, I have an idea what the boxes were for. I'm like, what? He's like, oh, I don't know if I want to say it. He was talking about growing crystals and using crystals. That's bizarre. Now, in your book, you mentioned that some of these Ajiji were working for like 3,600 years to terraform the earth or something like that. So, so getting back to, we kind of got a little bit off track, but you were talking about the origin of the Anunnaki was 4,500 years ago.
450,000.
I'm sorry. Yeah. 450,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And they came from somewhere else, right? That's the meaning. Anunnaki means not from Earth, right?
Right.
So they came after there was a bigger planet that was 6 times the size of Earth. It somehow smashed into something and created the Earth.
Right.
So after that, why did they come here, and how did the tablets say
Yes.
exactly why they came here?
If you notice in our book, The Epic of Humanity, there's the most tablets ever referenced in any one book in history, first of all. This book has more references to more tablets and excerpts from those tablets. And the reason why we're painting a picture that all these places from around the world and all these tablets and scriptures and papyruses and cylinder scrolls are all connected to one race of people that came from the Pleiadian star system. And they hail from the Pleiades. And in my new TV series called Anunnaki Ancient Secrets Revealed, which is coming out very soon in Regal Cinemas, and then it'll be on Forbidden TV, you'll find out that there was a galactic war in that sector of the galaxy. And this war was so crazy, they were using something called a Brahmahanda weapon, which can destroy any man on 3 worlds. We're talking about a real Death Star that existed in ancient times. This weapon, once it was released, you couldn't withdraw it. You couldn't bring it back. There was no way to cancel it. And you can operate it from something called a Tablet of Destiny. And whoever had their hands on these tablets of destiny had control of the galaxy, and they were stolen a couple of times. So power had been jumping back and forth. Imagine if we're here on this Earth and somebody blows up Saturn. We want to get off Earth because big chunks are coming our way. So there were something called space refugees. My personal opinion. This is not in any text. This is my opinion now. These people fled. This is how we got the Orion, Aldebaran, Zeta Reticulus, the Dog Star. All these other places began to get inhabited. Earth was another targeted location as a breakaway civilization. Some of these beings, according to the Enuma Elish, landed on a planet orbiting a brown dwarf called Nibiru. And some people say, oh, Nibiru was never in any ancient text. Yeah, look at the oldest version of the Enuma Elish. It says Nibiru and it says Anunnaki. The oldest version. Much later, in a newer version, which a few thousand years later, another copy was made by Amun-Ra. He changed Nibiru's name to Marduk because he wanted to be the destroyer. But anyway, that's another story. But the point is, these people decided, look, we're looking for breakaway civilizations. Us on Earth right now, human beings, if we just think that we're going to stay here on this planet forever, we're fooling ourselves. We need to also look for breakaway civilization. We got to create a breakaway civilization for ourselves. Our sun has already had middle age. It's going to die in 5 billion years, which seems like a long time, but that's a blink of an eye on geological timescales. Right. Earth is going to get swallowed up as it turns into a red giant because it'll shrink. If we want the humanity to progress, not only that, we've only been here on this planet, as a human being and Homo sapiens for 200,000 years at this level, a blink of an eye, less than a blink of an eye. In any geological time, at any time, any geological disaster can happen here, and that could collapse our entire civilization. Even if just one solar flare can turn us off and we'll be done. So we have to find a way to get off planet, which is why there's this big push for Mars. It's about creating a breakaway civilization, learning how to do it right, making mistakes along the way and learning from those, and then branching out even further into space. That's the plan. And so these beings came here because they're like, look, we got to find a breakaway civilization. They were scanning Earth, and they discovered from the scattered light that, like the same way we scan for elements, they discovered there was gold and other resources on the planet coming just from looking at the light of the planet, same way we do now in astrophysics. So they said, this is a great place. So one guy risked his life to get through the hammered bracelet and made it through. Then he radioed back to Nibiru and said, hey, I found everything we need right here. And then they started sending people down a little bit at a time, and they started building. And when they got here, Enlil, on a crystal tablet he showed to his sister, it says, Ninmah, he showed her the building construction technique that's going to be on this planet, he said, for all time. He already had it laid out, how he was going to build the cities, how he was going to build the plumbing, the everything, the way the city grid was going to be laid out. It was all on this crystal tablet. Now, what kind of tablet is a crystal tablet?
Right.
Sounds like an iPad or something.
Yeah.
In my opinion. Who sits around writing sci-fi stories 6,000 years ago? So somebody wrote this because they were told to, and I believe that what they wrote was exactly what possibly happened. I think we're getting as close to the truth as we can possibly get. Now, when they began doing all this building and all this work, we were already here. We meaning our cousins, human beings, cousins, not Homo sapien sapien, but the prior version of us was already here. Now, this prior version of us, in my opinion, was probably more advanced spiritually. I think that we had bigger bones, bigger skulls, bigger brains. I think our skulls have been found all over. I think they've been misunderstood in some cases, maybe even for aliens in some cases. But but that they had.
All right, guys and gals, we got to wrap this up. Woo woo will continue tomorrow. All right, tomorrow morning, I'm shooting an early show because I have to record for ABC News tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. So I'll shoot an early show, then I'll go and I'll record the ABC show in Tampa. Then I'll come back and I'll do Woo Woo at 3. So everybody, I'll see you tomorrow morning. Love you guys. Bye-bye.